This is Gerardo Del Real with Resource Stock Digest. Joining me today is the president and CEO of Leading Edge Materials. Once again, it's Mr. Mark Saxon. Mark, how are you today?
Very well, Gerardo. Bit of flu that you might hear in my voice, but apart from that, doing very well. And good afternoon. Always good to chat.
I appreciate you taking the time despite the flu. It's been a pretty important week on the macro level. You are one of the more insightful voices, not just in the rare earth space, but in the critical metal space. And so with with the headlines that we've seen in the rare earth space, prices are going up. We're hearing the saber rattling going on between China and the U.S. We understand how China plays the long game. I don't believe that the visit to the local rare earth plant by Chinese officials was coincidental. So before we talk about Leading Edge and the engineering study for battery graphite, which is critical to the EU, I want to talk and get your take on the rare earth space. You, of course, still have the world-class Nora Shah project. I'd love to touch on that a little bit, but give me your macro take, Mark, on rare earths, what's going on right now, and why Leading Edge has responded, frankly, with a 40-something% pop in the share price, albeit from a very depressed point, right?
Yeah, sure, Gerardo, and really, it's been a very interesting week, and I've had this conversation with plenty of commentators and plenty of investors, and really, it took us a little bit by surprise, I suppose, in terms of the timing of this bounce, but really anyone that's followed the sector hasn't been surprised that this was about to come, and the industry was really due for a turn, I suppose, in terms of the rare earth industry. So and that's really based on the fundamentals haven't changed at all since 2010, 2011, when we saw the last really major skyrocketing in rare earth pricing. So today, China is still very much the dominant producer of rare earth metals, very strong control over the downstream processing and the value add of those metals. So really, the visit by the Chinese President Xi to a rare earth factory in the rare earth area is really sending a message to say, this is important, this is relevant, this is something that the US has zero control over, and it's very much in Chinese hands. So the timing was unpredictable, but this was always going to happen, I suppose, and it's taken the industry by a little bit of surprise, I guess.
I've called it China loading the trade war gun. I believe the end game and the fatal blow will come, a couple of decades from now, from the bond market and China's dominance there. I think that's the long game. But in the interim, this is them loading up and sending a message. Let's talk a bit on Nora Shah. For those not familiar, the flagship is the Woxna project, the graphite project there in Sweden. But you also have a project that at one time demanded a market cap in the triple digits, and we're talking millions. So right now, not so much the case. I think the project's been forgotten by the market. I don't believe that many are aware of the asset. Can you just touch on it briefly, Mark, and describe it for people not familiar?
Yeah, sure. I'll cover the rare earth situation a little bit more broadly there, and tell you a little bit about Nora Shah, and really, I guess this situation that we're seeing in China, and then I guess is particularly directed towards the US, but Europe is in exactly the same position as the US is in this case, where processing technology and access to deposits and exploration really has been forgotten about for a very long time. So really, both Europe and the US are customers of rare earth metals and don't really have an alternative at this point. As a brief reminder, I suppose, rare earth metals are 15 different elements. They have very similar chemical properties. They occur together in nature. And each one has quite separate end market and different pricing. And in fact, the pricing from top to bottom can kind of vary by 100 times. So it's really quite hard to talk about rare earths in general form. But the real driver here is rare earth magnets. And so a number of the rare earths give the properties of very, very strong magnetism. And if you've ever held one of these magnets or seen one, then something that's, I guess, the size of your thumbnail, or let's say a 1 cubic centimetre square, if you stuck that to your fridge, then it's going to stay on your refrigerator forever until you sell the fridge. You're not getting it back off again. They're so strong. So these magnets allow for smaller and lighter and more efficient. And so particularly in electric vehicles, those magnets are becoming highly relevant because they greatly increase the vehicle efficiency. So in an electric vehicle, you've got the battery and the battery drives the car, but the performance of the battery relates to the weight of the car. And so obviously there's a big move to try to lightweight the vehicle because that greatly increases the performance of the battery.
It's interesting to me that Tesla, and not to cut you off, Mark, but a quick point. It's interesting to me that Tesla for about a year and a half or two was looking for ways to diversify away from those rare earth magnets, and just recently announced that they're coming back to it because the bottom line is that was the best in class material for them. So again, speaks to your point, right?
Yeah, exactly. And really it's only 1 or 2 kilograms of magnets per Tesla. So in terms of the cost input, it's not huge. And you would think that 1 or 2 kilos in a car doesn't make that much difference. But when you only have one supplier, which is China, then obviously you've got to be very cautious of your supply networks. And Tesla, like every other auto company, has to be choosing the best solutions. And if you sit around and you choose second best solutions versus one of your competitors, then you're obviously not going to be competitive for very long. And rare earths really are that best performer in the market. And so I think it's something like 80 to 90% of electric vehicles built use rare earth magnets in their motors. And really there's no incentive to change that unless the price goes again by 10 times. That'll scare the market. But at current pricing, it's the best solution, and they'll be integrated for a very long time.
Let's talk about Nora Shar. Nora Shar is a project that's a world-class asset. I want you to speak to that a bit, because I know it's a project that for a while was a bit stalled, largely in parts to some local opposition. You have huge government support for that project, and there appears to be a path forward now, a clear path forward when it comes to that. So can you touch on that just a bit, Mark?
Yeah, sure. I'll touch on a bit of the history and I guess the future at Nora Shar. And so Nora Shar sits in southern Sweden, and was a discovery we made in 2009. And we went and we spent a lot of money. We created a resource. We created a pre-feasibility study over about 5 years. And during that time, we applied for a mining lease over the project because we were confident it was moving ahead. I guess we fell into a bit of a hole there because the Mining Act in Sweden hadn't really been tested in a few areas, and we were working in a new part of Sweden where mining wasn't quite as traditional as it is in the north of the country, and so we impacted on some local areas that where people didn't really understand the questions and answers about mining, and so there was an appeal made against our our mining lease, and the mining lease was found that it required more information, and this didn't just apply to our mining lease. It was a test of the Mining Act itself, and so there was half a dozen mining leases across Sweden that all went back to government for testing and then got passed back to the Mines Inspectorate. So for further adjudication and for further information. So we're still going through that process now. So we've had regular communication with the local people. We've had regular communication with the Mining Inspectorate and with the government. It's still in process. It's a very important project on a European scale, and we've been spending European money in terms of research and development. So we've been part of a very major project called EU Rare, which was spending European Commission money on some of our research that's greatly optimized the processing. I can't make promises, but I'm optimistic, and a slow process, but one that's still moving ahead.
Now, Leading Edge Materials currently has a market cap of approximately 15 million Canadian, give or take 1 or 2 million. Do you remember the after-tax MPV of just Nora Shar? And we'll talk walks here in just a bit. I just want to provide a bit of context as to the disconnect in the markets right now.
Yeah, I won't talk numbers, but it's measured in the it's many times of what our market cap is anyway. So it's well into the many hundreds of millions, and really that was based about rare earth pricing that was similar to where we are today. So obviously we believe that the project will be very economic at current pricing. We've done a lot of work to optimize the project, and that's in terms of using of byproduct materials, reducing the land use, reducing the water use. So really being responsive, I suppose, to the concerns of the local region. And I think the project will look quite different when we come back with new technologies. And really that's the rare earth market overall, that the industry has moved on quite quickly because a lot of research has been done. So there's been great research in rare earth separation technology, in end markets, and also in the processing as well. So, I guess that's part of the reason we're quite confident that the project has a second life.
You talked about the different types of rare earths. There's the lights, there's the heavies. The heavies, of course, are the ones that are typically and traditionally looked at as the higher demand, harder to find, more expensive, more critical ones. And Nora Shah, I believe, is very well endowed when it comes to having heavy rare earth elements. Is that accurate?
Yeah, exactly. And really, we're getting quite specific now, I suppose. But Nora Shah is very rich in a metal called dysprosium. And dysprosium is a metal that's added to rare earth magnets, which allows them to operate at higher temperatures. And so the rare earth magnets have an unusual effect that when the temperature gets too high, they lose their magnetism. But add a small amount of dysprosium, which is quite a valuable material, add a small amount into the magnet, and its magnetism will retain at high temperature. So particularly when you think about use in vehicles where the temperature in an engine can get quite high, then the amount of dysprosium increases. In a wind turbine, they're also used in tons, I suppose. Tons of magnets are used in wind turbines. They don't get quite as hot, so the amount of dysprosium is a little bit lower in those applications, but very important in electrical vehicles.
We've talked about the importance of establishing a Chinese-free supply chain for the critical metals. Graphite is a large part of that effort. You just achieved, the company just achieved a big milestone. You received your engineering study for the battery graphite demonstration plant at Woxna. Can we talk about that? Congratulations on that front. I know that's a long time coming, a lot of hard work behind the scenes that's gone on there. Can you speak to that a bit and why that's important?
Yeah, sure, absolutely, Gerardo. And I guess you mentioned there the supply chain issues, and really we're seeing that very much in a European context, that having secure supply chains are becoming far more important because a battery and an automotive industry is now far more dependent on these critical materials. And so, on one side it's magnets, on the other side it's batteries. So the graphite that comes from a project like Woxna, we're hoping to prepare that to be appropriate for lithium-ion batteries. At the moment, the lithium-ion battery market in Europe, in terms of production, is quite small. They're customers, obviously, but the production is quite small. But really, that is going almost exponential in terms of growth, and there's some very major investments in the pipeline that they'll be producing a lot of lithium-ion batteries. And in a lithium-ion battery, it's about 15% graphite. So they really want local sourcing, and it's a key part of their supply strategies to have local sourcing. So for us at Woxna, Woxna is a fully built graphite mine in central Sweden that we purchased in 2010. And I guess traditionally it was producing graphite for the steel industry. Looking forward, we're hoping to produce graphite for the lithium-ion battery market. And so we've just completed the engineering study, which will allow us to build a demonstration plant for 100 kilograms per day of lithium-ion battery anode. So that can really flow out into the market, and so the customers can test it and really build batteries with our material and see how it performs, and that's really a very big part of the industry. And you can imagine that safety obviously is very important in battery technologies, and so they need to receive large volumes. The customer needs to receive large volumes of graphite. They need to test it over 6 to 12 months and really do that stress testing to make sure it performs well. And that goes for all battery materials, not just graphite. And the qualification process is quite long.
To long-term subscribers, not to cut you off, Mark, but to long-term subscribers of mine and listeners, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I'm going to ask the question again for new listeners and potentially new subscribers. How many other juniors have a fully permitted, fully built graphite mine in Sweden or in the EU?
Yes, so we're in a very unique position there, and there's a number of very small graphite mines in Europe. So one in Norway, one in Austria, I believe, one in the Ukraine, but they're not producing materials that are suitable for the battery market. So today, 100% of battery anode material comes from China. So yeah, every single piece of natural graphite that's used in a battery, in an EV, in a telephone, comes from a Chinese source. So that imbalance really can't last, and the transition will not be fast, but absolutely that transition has to come, and Woxner and Leading Edge Materials is in a great position for that.
Excellent. Mark, thank you for the thorough update. Is there anything else that you'd like to touch on?
No, I think we've touched on most things there, Gerardo, and really it's been a very interesting week, and a little unexpected on the rare earth front, but it was always going to happen. So I guess we've been watching the industry from the sidelines, and after this week we'll be a little more focused on rare earths as well, I think. So happy to share the story.
I know you're working hard behind the scenes on multiple fronts, so I get the feeling that we're going to be chatting again here soon. Thanks again today, Mark. Get well.
Okay, thanks, Gerardo. Chat soon. Cheers, bye.